All right, I think we will get started. Thank you everyone for being here and welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. My name is Robert Dorr and I am the Morgridge Fellow in Poverty Studies here at AEI, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here and to introduce our guest today. This morning's event is part of AEI's Philanthropic Freedom Project, which was founded in 2013 to celebrate the essential role that private, charity, nonprofit groups, and civil society play in helping the most vulnerable Americans rise up. We've had some great speakers as part of this series, including Bill Gates, Melinda Gates, Jean Case, Sue Desmond-Hellman, Jacqueline Novogratz, Dan Pallotta, and Dina Powell. And we're thrilled today that Patty Stonesifer can join us today to contribute her wisdom on the charitable giving and nonprofit management. Patty serves as a volunteer in the role of president and CEO of Martha's Table. She is also lead director of the corporate board of Amazon.com, where she has served as director for the past 19 years. She spent the first 20 years of her career as a technology executive and the next 12 years building the world's largest foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. But almost more importantly, Martha's Table was founded 37 years ago and today provides education programs, food access programs, and a number of community support services here in the nation's capital. And in 2018, as I'm sure Patty will point out, Martha's Table is opening 2 new locations in Washington. To serve as our interviewer and inquisitor, we have AEI's Vice President for Development and Academic Programs, Toby Stock. Toby has been at AEI for nearly 9 years. Prior to joining AEI, he served as Dean of Admissions at Harvard Law School. Thank you again for joining us today. I'm very glad we're having this event. It's another effort on the part of AEI and the Poverty Studies Group to reiterate that poverty fighting happens in all kinds of spheres and often is most effective in the community and not-for-profit space. So thanks, Patty, for being here. Thank you for your work. And Toby, take it away.
Thank you, Robert. Really appreciate it. And thanks, Patty, for being here. I want to start by going back in time a little bit before we get to Martha's Table, where we're going to talk a lot about, I think, later on. But I want to start with, so you're known today as a very innovative nonprofit leader, but you started in the private sector and had a lot of success with an extremely dynamic company. How did a Midwestern kid from Indiana grow up and then end up at Microsoft and kind of the early stages of that exciting place? How did that happen?
Well, welcome. Thank you all for being here, right? And thank you, Toby, for the invite. Let me also, I think he probably just ducked out the door, but let me also just thank Robert and the rest of the folks who write about these issues in such a thoughtful way here at AEI. I came to Microsoft. My path was at that moment the kind of the accidental tech executive. I was a, smart girl, 6th of 9 children from a Midwestern family, and I dropped out of college fairly early. I was a good writer, got married, needed to find family wage work, and had 2 children. And writing was my skill, but writing about the tech sector was my check, right? That was the way to bridge both the living wage income and the ability to use my communication skills. So I always walked the line between those who built the technology and those who consumed the technology. It's just that in the late 70s, early 80s, there weren't very many people who had gone to school for that. So we were literally pulling people off the street, giving them aptitude tests, found out that musicians from the University of California at Santa Barbara, especially if they composed, would make great COBOL programmers. I taught COBOL programming. I literally learned one step ahead of the people who were coming on board to build technology. And so I was running a computer book publishing company out of the Midwest when Microsoft, who was number 2 in word processing to WordPerfect, number 2 or 3 to Lotus 1-2-3 and Symphony and spreadsheets, was way behind IBM in a whole bunch of different ways, decided they needed to hire some adult management. And I was almost 30. And so the phone rang at my desk in Indianapolis, and I'd been writing and publishing books for this company called Q Corporation out of the Midwest about computer books. And my phone rang, and the recruiter from Microsoft said, would you come out and consider moving to Seattle? And so it wasn't that I was so brilliant and insightful that they'd surge to number one in this category, number one in this category, number one in this category, except for that I got on a plane and got off in Seattle and said, this is a better place to raise my kids. This will be a place that I could do work that I loved, which was the belief that computers had the power to make an opportunity for everyone, and a place where it seemed family friendly. And so I was accidentally one of the early executives as Microsoft went through a very big growth spurt. Started out at the book publishing company, ended up running the Canadian subsidiary out of 6 offices in Canada, then came back and was the executive in charge of technical support around the world. And then my last job was running all of the consumer products with the hardware and small business products and education products and the internet products. And I always say, if you had a good time with Microsoft products, that was mine. If you were getting something highly productive done, that was my partners in the business division. But I ran all of the consumer products, research, development, and marketing. And it was just that moment in time at a startup company where leadership was important, aptitude was important, experience was a little less critical because we were all gaining experience every day. And it was just a wonderful, wonderful opportunity in what I thought then was a real meritocracy. Looking back at it, I realized there were probably some real gaps in that meritocracy, but I was lucky to be one of the exceptions at the table.
Mm-hmm. What was the culture like, and how did it change over the years? And how did that, the sense you had of culture there, what did you take from that to your later experiences, if anything?
Well, there were 2 aspects of the Microsoft culture that stand out. One is that it really was a blank sheet of paper, that you didn't have the sense that we have to do it this way because this is what customers want, or we have to do it this way because this is what we've been doing for 20 years or 30 years or 40 years. Because that blank sheet of paper and what is the right way to think about X, what is the right thing to play into the future, and the future will arrive, probably not as quick as we'd predicted, but it will arrive. So that blank sheet of paper and that sense of possibility is what made the place so exciting. Being given the autonomy, whether it was in a small business group that you pulled together, a small programming group, or a small marketing group, to really do what you thought was necessary. The second thing was that it was highly competitive, internally as well as externally. And I think the internal competition was one of the things that really hurt it. In that the biggest fights you might have at Microsoft at that time would be with possibly with another product group, with another area that had an idea on their blank sheet of paper that competed with your idea. And the thing that I've learned with those 20 plus years at Amazon that you referred to is that if you move from thinking of competition, whether that competition is Word perfect, and because Microsoft was very competitive on that. My colleague who ran Word could tell you the head of WordPerfect's home address, how many kids they had, what they liked for dinner. They knew everything about competition, every feature they needed to beat. Learning, knowing, and beating your competition was deeply embedded in the culture. And so when you become about the competition, you lose a little bit of that blank sheet of paper, right? And so the thing about Amazon is that it's relentlessly customer focused. If you talk about competitors, it is as an afterthought. It really is, what do people need that still doesn't exist that we might be good at doing? And I think that that competitive nature both didn't create the best culture inside Microsoft, but ultimately also led to some of the challenges we had here in DC, which accentuated the challenges for Microsoft. And I think many of the things that happened in DC, many of the investigations and claims about Microsoft were quite unfair. Mm-hmm. But it was such a competitive culture that we gave a lot of fuel to the idea that bigness was really a damage for consumers or damaging for customers or other partners.
So you transitioned from Microsoft to help Bill and Melinda Gates really go deep in philanthropy. What led you to make that move, and what were the early years like as you all were really setting up the organization, trying to figure out what it was going to be all about?
Well, as the female senior executive at Microsoft, Melinda worked for me, and I worked for Bill, but it was small, and we were in the trenches together and really spent a lot of time together. So I knew very early on, we had discussions at executive retreats about, after you make $1 million, then what do you do, right? What do you need more than that? Is it 1 million or is it 2 million? And that is still a huge amount of money, but compared to the wealth that people at Microsoft, and especially Bill at the top of Microsoft, built, he really, from the very beginning, was saying you only need so many pairs of socks. You've got to figure out how to plow it back into society. So we had lots of conversations about that when we were still largely building software, when we didn't know what would really happen to our own assets and our own family. So he and I knew we shared those values, and then Melinda and I became very close because she built a lot of the products in the consumer division. She was the brilliant general manager, and if she hadn't married the boss, she probably would have been one of the most senior female executives at Microsoft, but chose to opt out when her first child was born. So we were friends first and foremost. We shared values about the use of wealth in society, and we shared values about that gap between what we believed about meritocracy and opportunity in the world and what was. And so when they got married, Bill's mother made this wonderful speech. She was actually very sick at the time about to whom much is given, much is expected, you know, a familiar refrain no matter what discipline you're from. And when I decided at the ripe old age of 40 that 10 years of being one of the grown-ups at Microsoft was enough because I'd achieved more than I wanted, and I went to work for DreamWorks, at my going away party, Bill said, "We have an idea. You have to come talk to us." And I said, "I just said yes to these guys." But the idea that they had was to really start with their dad to take this to a new scale, and that my partnership with them would allow them to really move further and faster. And we shared so many of the beliefs about what change could happen. What I said then was, I'll only do this as a volunteer. And then I spent over 10 years doing it as a volunteer CEO, helping friends transfer their values and beliefs into a set of priorities and program lines to pursue change in the world that matched their values and what we knew about the world and what we were interested in.
What were some of the key questions that you all had to solve early on? So you shared values, you had a sense for what they wanted to do, but what were the decision points that you could have gone one way or the other and you guys decided to go this way instead of this way? I'm just kind of curious.
Well, there's no question, and looking back, both one of the strengths of the Gates Foundation, one of the weaknesses, is that we were technocrats, right? We were looking for and believing in the idea of product almost as solution, not always product, but something that was discrete and had edges to it and you could identify, right? So advocacy and government, those were not really in our vocabulary. I literally would fly around the world and try to avoid the government in places. And then we had to learn that if you wanted to do something about polio, you were gonna have to be arm in arm with the government. You wanted to do something about the spread of HIV in India, you had to first be with the government, because ultimately so we started, I think, with the idea of where could our belief that technology has improved the lives of millions, if not billions, where could we stand on the shoulders of the investments being made and push it towards those who were so late to get advantages of technology, which is what led us to biotech. Because while we started out with the Library Foundation, connecting every library in America to the internet and training librarians, it became clear very quickly from the New York Times and others that there wasn't much we could do in technology without ending up on the front page of the paper and being seen as part of some kind of vast conspiracy for Windows. And so we decided that while we would continue to support libraries, information technology was not going to be a technology that we were front and center for. However, much of the same kind of investment and excitement was happening around biotechnologies and health technologies. And that disparity in health outcomes was far more important than the disparity in information outcomes, because unless you were healthy, you couldn't get to the information outcomes. So we use that same kind of I would say, technocratic bias to look at research and development around the world that was holding back development in general, and say, where could we give a good shove to research development of new health technologies that in partnership with others could actually begin a cycle of improved health and opportunity for others. So it was natural for us to do that. When we looked at the United States, however, most things work pretty well here, in spite of the many ways we could all sit here and talk about all the things that don't work. There wasn't a malaria or polio to address there, because we did have agencies and efforts that were good at protecting some of us, most of us. But we did land on education, but we were education neophytes, and that continued to bedevil us, I think, for much of the first years of our work, in that Bill, Melinda, and myself were all products of private school. I was a product of Catholic schooling, and Melinda was also, and then Bill was private schools, a range of schools. And so trying to address what we saw as one of the remaining big, basically civil rights issues, which is the unequal access to quality education in the United States, became our strongest belief. So we knew what we were trying to change and who we were trying to stand with in that change, but the how, we were very novice in. Mm-hmm. And I think, honestly, many people have come before us and tried to make changes in that how, and they're still learning. I'm still learning. We're all still learning on how to close that divide in the access to a quality education, which we all believe in the United States correlates very tightly with access to opportunity. Mm-hmm.
So it seems right now there's a number of other folks who've made a lot of money in the tech industry who are setting up foundations or different kinds of entities. A lot of them seem to not be foundations now. They seem to be other kinds of entities for various reasons. As you look back at that experience, if you were guiding them on a few things to think about, given the experience you all had, anything comes to mind that you might suggest as advice to those who are, I mean, it seems like there's a lot of money that's going to be plowed into these foundations or new foundations that we haven't even heard of yet in the next few years. So I'm curious what advice you might have.
The one bit of advice is not simple, because there's a real risk tension to it, which is go ahead and take risks. If it was straightforward, if your first idea was doable, someone else would have already done it. And along with that, take big risks, is this need to learn deeply, not just from those who have come before writing great papers, but those who are on the ground and in the trenches and leading families and trying to make change. And I think for the most part, those who make a great deal of money in one generation made it because they were at some level technocrats. They had a new widget, whether it was Bloomberg's approach to terminals or Bezos' approach to distribution or, and that idea of the solutions to big social issues not necessarily coming solely out of your head, but yes, use your head, use a whole lot of other inputs, but also get close and deep into the situation. We said a lot about listening, but in hindsight, I think sometimes we used a quote a lot. I used a quote that I learned on my first trip to Africa: if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And we talked about that at Gates a lot. But in hindsight, I think we might have meant, if you want to go far, join us. And that is not the same thing as go together, right? Go together really is take the time to build the buy-in, the awareness, the ownership, the cooperation. And we're impatient, and I think Bill and Melinda still use the idea of impatient optimists. It's very important, I think, if you have a whole lot of money, not to sit on it like Horton Hears a Who or something, to just be waiting for that moment to start, but be humble and aware and learning enough and leave yourself exits. And exits in this social change, it's very hard. There's a lot of, and I think some of your folks have even written about it. It's hard to say, okay, it's teacher quality today, and okay, that wasn't sufficient, it's X or it's Y, it's Z. Exiting, if you're messing in social change and social sector, it's very hard to take, where is where is the ability to take risks? However, if you ship Microsoft Bob and it doesn't sell, it just comes back, right? So the skills that you learn, whether you're at Amazon creating a new phone that doesn't make it and you take those risks and learn from them, that doesn't work as well in the social sector. So when I say my best advice comes with attention, taking big risks, trying new things, has to be done with a certain kind of humbleness that you could screw a lot of things up in the process and leave a lot of people to clean up behind you if you take those risks in an irresponsible way. But we have to try new approaches and new things. You heard me talking to Robert about how do we create zones to try to apply more of the ideas that are coming out of the brilliant thinking in this town and in New York and other places, because the gap between what people know and what we're all at the line able to apply is so huge. It's just huge, the gap between us.
So you leave in 2008 the Gates Foundation. How did you manage to make sure there was a successful transition? And in the nonprofit space, that's often a problem. So how do you think about transitions in the nonprofit space generally? Any advice on that front?
Well, this was a little exceptional in that I left as Bill Gates arrived, right? So he had spent the prior almost 30 years at Microsoft and had announced his retirement in 2006 with his exit date in 2008. And I literally said, now your need for a volunteer to run this is done. I can exit. I had thought I'd leave long before that. In 1997 when we started, I had two kids, a 13 and 16-year-old. Still have two kids, but they were 13 and 16. And my thought was, until they get into college, I'll do this. But the new challenges, new opportunities, new resources kept coming on board, and then Warren Buffett transferring his money. So handing it over to Bill and to Melinda, where the kids were much older now, and she felt she could really dive in a way that when she had three very young kids, she couldn't do. It was easy. Talk about transition.
Yeah.
Another ex-Microsoft colleague took my place. He did not stay as long, and Sue Desmond-Hellman, who many of you may have met in this forum, and is an amazing leader. Jeff Rakes was also a great leader, but he handed the reins over to Sue Desmond-Hellman, who I think is a fabulous leader. But Bill and Melinda's day-to-day leadership of the foundation really ramped up enormously in 2008. Succession in the nonprofit sector is a little bit trickier, and we all have trouble. I think you actually may have a colleague who wrote about the fact that we underpay in the nonprofit sector, so we have much more churn, and because folks, for rational reasons, keep seeking the way that they can put their kids into school, or they can do X, or they can do Y. So we have more churn in the nonprofit sector than I think is good. If you consider us to be tackling some of the hardest problems, you want a little bit more constancy and consistency in the top than I think we have today.
So we'll move us to where you are now, which is Martha's Table. For those in the room unfamiliar with Martha's Table, could you give a little bit of background on why it exists and what prompted its founding and what it does?
In 1979, 14th Street was a unsafe area, and a social work professor from Georgetown named Veronica Maz felt that she should quit teaching and start applying. So she wanted to move from, I would say, from like I was at Gates, where I was able to move resources and ideas to the front line. And she began to assemble money and apply for the legal status that created Martha's Table. She also created House of Ruth and several other nonprofits, heavily inspired by a Jesuit priest out of Gonzaga named Father McKenna. And the two of them have left a mark on the nonprofit sector in DC that should be the envy of any small business entrepreneurs, and that nonprofits, just like small businesses, disappear all the time, but these places were based in such. So her notion when she opened the doors was the neighborhood nanny. There was a lot of prostitution, there was a lot of drug sales, there was a lot of risk for children in that neighborhood, yet there were a lot of children. And so how about having a safe place where children received a hot meal, but also the protection and nurturing that sometimes they were missing? And that began Martha's Table history in food and early childhood and childhood supports. What's happened over that 37 years is DC has changed enormously, but so has our knowledge of what is food, what is good food, what is quality food, how does food relate to other issues in our life, and who needs food. That has changed a lot, as well as what is good care for the youngest children. We now know a lot about brain science in those first 5 years. We know a lot about academic readiness when children hit school. So Martha's Table on those two pillars continued to build with the idea that every child should have their greatest opportunity and a community and family committed to their success. So in addition, one of the things we've done is we've wrapped our arms around the families. Parent engagement is something that people talk a lot about now, but I think it's one of the most missed issues in our social programs, in that if we're just taking care of the child and not considering that the child is going to spend 3, 4, 5 times more time with the family than with whoever is the early childhood educator or whoever is the health, then we're missing a big opportunity. So we are still building with high quality early childhood, out of school time supports, ongoing programming as children age, and parent supports. We're building on what Veronica Maz started all back then. And on food, many of you that were raised in DC or raised your children in DC, think of Martha's Table as McKenna's wagon that goes out every night of the year, no matter what, with volunteers to distribute food on the streets to those most in need. And those most in need was kind of the old charitable model. And we continue to do that as an important nod to our legacy, and of course to serve the 400 plus people who rely on that hot meal every night and use the sandwiches made all over town. It's a wonderful volunteer experience. I invite any of you to come. But we have 39 pop-up joyful food markets in elementary schools east of the river. The majority of hunger in this region is in the families. It's in studio apartments, it's in shared housing, it's in low-income workers, and it manifests, yes, as food insecurity, not knowing whether or not you'll have enough money that month, that week, that day to put food on the table for your family, but it also manifests itself as diabetes, hypertension, high obesity rates, and that is hugely concentrated east of the Anacostia River, where there are 3 full-service grocery stores for 160,000 people. And in contrast, this area with 80,000 people in this ward has 8 full-service grocery stores. 80,000 people, 8, versus 160,000 people, 3. And believe me, you are unlikely to want to shop in any of those 3, because even though they're familiar chain names, they're resourced differently, their produce changes differently. It's difficult to access high quality foods. So we used a lot of what I learned at Gates and Amazon blended to create what is more like a public health model for these joyful food markets. We use the elementary school as the point of distribution. At 3 o'clock when the bell rings, someone dressed like a banana and somebody else dressed like a tomato is dancing in the hallways. Young chefs who are from the community are making food with the beautiful produce that is distributed. Families shop for free for 3 to 4 days worth of food. But it begins to beg the question, what do you do about the other 27 days? And that's where we're asking ourselves now, how does Martha's Table continue to play out its mission around healthy food and food insecurity in the broader need for food systems work in DC? How do we play out the belief that every child should have the educational opportunity when the literacy scores in Park in the neighborhood school, where we will be almost edge to edge, the 3rd grade literacy accomplishment is 4.8% of the children in that school meet or exceed expectations for 3rd grade literacy. 5%. Not, what is that set up for 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade? It's horrendous. So how do we affect not just early childhood, but through all of our other programming and partnership with the schools and partnership with other nonprofits, how do we change that trajectory in our new neighborhood? How do we change the trajectory of access to and consumption of healthy food independent of free food. Yes, free food's got a role, but there's more than free food involved in having access to a healthy food system.
How do you think
a very long sentence.
Well, how do you think about focus, maintaining some sense of focus and mission, and not falling prey to mission creep, while at the same time allowing the mission to extend to things that you believe are related to what you need to work on and they will help the core mission? I mean, how do you think, you have limited resources, you have limited time for yourself and your staff, how do you kind of figure that out?
I do think the answer is partnerships, partnerships, partnerships. And, I do think the competition for limited resources often makes the nonprofit sector less ideal of partnerships. But a lot has emerged over the last 6 years about the power of collective work. And here in DC, we have Raise DC that is cradle to career. But in each of our neighborhoods, each of our efforts, we need to build the series of partnerships so that the family that is already under stress doesn't always have to be the world's best general contractor. Anybody who's raised a kid knows that at some level, parent and general contractor are synonymous when you're trying to match your child with the right programming and the right access and the right part-time job and the right X and Y and Z. But in a highly stressed family, some of that is the role of the community-based organization. What can we, if you attend Martha's Table or you bring your infant there or you bring your out-of-school time, how can we ensure you have access to the mental health professionals? We're not mental health professionals, but we're gonna co-locate with Community of Hope in our new building. They'll have 10,000 square feet attached to our 43,000 square feet because we know mental health issues are one of the biggest issues for young families in this area that are unmet. And so they will co-reside. How can we work with the literacy programs that are scattered across DC to ensure that as we move the children through Martha's Table, where we have a great literacy coach and are working on changing literacy scores, how can we make sure Moton Elementary and the neighborhood schools have the same kind of additional interventions? What are the programs that we could attract and say, if we do this together, A plus B is going to equal something that will really drive attention, resources, and most importantly, impact. Because resources come out of impact. So if together we think we could get something bigger, we have to set aside that constant fear for whether we'll be able to get the money to keep it going and say, a business would say, let's at least try it, see if it works. You have to have some level of cooperative risk capital to put to it. And we need donors that understand that to allow that kind of clumsiness of early partnerships to work. But we are looking at all the needs that our families have, and then we'll learn a tremendous amount in 2018, 2019 as we make the move off of 14th Street to the new headquarters in Ward 8. And we will learn from those families and those family leaders. We're already learning from them now through the Joyful Food Markets and through standing up an advisory council and family council. We'll learn what additional supports they want to see out of this area and how can we bring those folks into either the Martha's Table shell or to other spaces in the area and try to connect ourselves so that families have access to the range. Because we don't lack for nonprofits in town. We lack for probably cohesion of services. I believe, and am I allowed to say Brookings here? I believe strongly in Bell Sawhill's Brookings social genome model that shows that even if you have the world's best early childhood quality interventions, you also need something at third grade. You may also, that a child born into a low-income family has multiple points of intervention over this long arc of development. And no organization can do the highest quality job at that. We need to stitch those services together with local universities, with local thinkers, with local doers, and put those together to try to show that a cohort appropriately invested in can have outcomes that are greater than all of our singular interventions are producing. And I think we can do this in this new neighborhood with both the backing of other partners and donors that understand the need, and the city, who has come forward in a good way for some of these things.
Can you talk more about that move? So you're relocating from a location nearer to here, I think, or
Yes,
14th Street.
Yeah.
to across the river, and it seems like the decision is both being in a neighborhood that maybe requires more support now, but also some financial advantage maybe to move from a place where you can much less expensive to live now or be now than you were before. How did you kind of think that through? Are there any negatives to that?
So there's one additional piece to this, and I say in some ways we were doing this kind of what do you want to do, and then where do you live? It felt like a Twister game that we'd have one hand down and one hand up and trying to figure out how to reach the next thing. Because we did decide at the same time that the need for Martha's Table still existed in Ward 1. There is still a significant amount of senior hunger and a significant amount of working families trying to find quality early childhood. And one of the things we believe that's happened in Ward 1 is that housing is a real obstacle for families there. So we have partnered with Jubilee Housing, who has 10 different wonderful housing in a new project called the Maycroft, which will open in September of 2018. We'll have an early childhood center, food programming there, and still operate McKenna's Wagon out of there. It'll be a much smaller center than the one on 14th, but it will offer the services that are still required in that neighborhood. At the same time, we will move our headquarters, and whether you're fundraisers or accountants or your early childhood teachers, after school teachers, food programming folks, you will move with us to Ward 8, to a neighborhood that is at the intersection of Hillsdale and Fort Stanton. If you've ever been to Frederick Douglass's house over there, it's in that area with a beautiful view of the city, but an area of great need. And for us, it also is about the idea that we didn't think one intervention was necessary. On 14th Street, we are close to being a retail social service agency. So you come to us when you need, and then you go off to your home, which is far away from that 14th Street neighborhood because the housing is such a burden. In the neighborhood we're moving, we'll be able to see the families 24-hour, 7-day a week. We will be part of the community, both with our staff and ourselves, and really, we hope, see that long arc of development and be part of working with that mom who really wants to see the child who's stuck in middle school on topic X break through and continue on the trajectory towards college. So for us, it's also about proving the model that a community-based organization is still relevant as a critical player in offering some of the critical services, in our case, education supports as well as food supports, but also in being there through the long arc of development. And 14th Street just wasn't a very good place to. Now, is it helpful that with our costs going up 40%, we do own some of the property on 14th Street. We don't own all of it, but we own part of it, and that will help stabilize our finances with building a new headquarters and help us keep both debt and our balance sheet in control. The real scary part for us is if you're out of sight, out of mind, if we're not on 14th Street, how will you know? And we need to convince and encourage folks to come and see what we're trying to do in this community development model, focused on children and their parents, yes, but a more community development model over in Ward 8, because we think there's something important to be done there and that we can do it with the right support.
Mm-hmm. I want to broaden out now to some of your thoughts that can relate to a lot of different nonprofits and philanthropies. When you think about it from the perspective of a nonprofit CEO, what are some of the challenges that you have in communicating your work to prospective donors or to the public or to other organizations that might help to amplify your work or make it more impactful? Do you feel like it's tough to get the message out? How do you think about communications?
Well, I am a bit of an outlier because my path was so unusual that I've had a little bit easier time at least getting the first meeting, right? And that is something that is a challenge for so many nonprofit leaders, which is how do I get the opportunity to tell my story? So I'll just start at the fact that I have an unusual advantage and that the network that I bring can somehow, sometimes get me the first meeting. But then when you get in the meeting, it's tricky, right? It is very hard to convince people that change can happen and that we have a theory of change, that we believe we see early indications. This joyful food market work, the numbers are shocking. The drop in food insecurity, the increase in healthy eating. It disassembles all of the myths about these people don't want X or they don't want Y or they don't want Z. The speed at which those numbers change says it is about access. It is certainly, there is some education to be done when new foods are introduced for all of us, whether it's kale in my house or squash in yours. There's some learning and education to be done, but it is not about differences in culture and all the other reasons we like to hide behind to not invest in these things. So convincing a small number of people to put risk money in and then being able to quickly show some progress, some things are just not quick. Johnny and Sally, who show up at 12 weeks old, when we opened in when we opened in May of 2018 over in Ward 8, it'll take a while before we can show whether third grade reading levels are different for them. And so we need some folks who are believers. With the food systems work, we need some folks who are willing to put risk capital in. And that discussion is tricky. The other thing, and I was a tremendously on the wrong side of this, is it's not all about projects. It does require investing in organizations. So
When you say you're on the wrong side of this, you mean when you were on the
at
grant
Gates,
making
we were
side?
all about projects, right? We
Yeah.
really weren't so interested in building up organizations. Even our own, I would say for the first X number of years, Bill and Melinda never wanted the word foundation to have a capital letter in it, right? It wasn't a place. It wasn't about the entity. It was about, a way to move money through to people that could do things right. But we didn't think about whether or not we had to build organizations that last as much as we felt we needed to prove that polio eradication could work. So there'll be something behind polio. And don't you want those data systems and that learning and those organizations to be set up to be considering that leading up to the next great thing, to have the capacity to take that knowledge and transfer it? It's tricky to know. When the word convening would come up at the Gates Foundation, we would just shudder. Yet I see at the frontline level that bringing the folks working on food systems together, it's very important. So the need to invest and to convince people to invest in institutional strength as well as the strength of individual projects is a hurdle. And the other thing is that you try in every organization to take your greatest leader and put them at the helm. But in the nonprofit world, that greatest leader is doing a dog and pony to raise money 60% of the time. And that's true of me. I spend probably 60% of my time in one form or another raising our reputation or resources. And yet the biggest thing we should want, me and my peers, to be doing is really trying to understand that dynamic between how much support do we need to give to the parent to see the child's trajectory change. The puzzles we are faced with are very real. And yet that challenge of building up enough institutional capacity to focus on those things. So we have organizations like yours that think always about the puzzles and the policies, and then organizations like ours that are funded to just go do it. And the gap between those two is just so large because we don't invest in institutional strength.
So be prepared to start asking questions. I'm going to ask one more, and then I'm going to turn to the audience. The question I have for you, you referenced it a bit earlier when I think you mentioned folks like Dan Pallotta who've written about, he did this session actually with us at one point, but nonprofit talent. Mm-hmm. And how do you think about sourcing, paying, rewarding, just generally how do you get folks that are great to work for you? It seems that there are a lot of people who want to go and work with nonprofits, but also seems to be also difficult to retain and attract talent in some ways. So how do you think about that problem?
Well, another part of your work needs to be about how do you get a higher education at a price that people aren't loaded with debt and or worried about their children. Because I do think Jim Collins does a lot of work on good to great in nonprofits and in business, and he has this Venn diagram that's very simple. What is your passion? What can you be best in the world at? And what drives your resource engine? And so in the nonprofit world, I could be meeting every single day of the week with someone whose passion and what they believe they could be really good at is in the nonprofit world, but they don't know how to align their resource engine. They're hoping to make foundation-sized salaries working at Martha's Table, and the model just doesn't work that way. So we do have to find people who have the passion, who have the ability to be really great, like Amazon does, like Microsoft, and who are willing to tune their resource model to the wages and long-term opportunity of the nonprofit sector. I had the opportunity to zigzag from the private sector to the nonprofit sector and back. We would benefit from more of that too, because that would, but you can't presume that the CEO of your nonprofits are going to have been at Microsoft in the 80s. It's just not, there are not enough people that are correctly aligned for that. So whether you want to be a infant teacher, if you establish a life that uses the resource engine that salary affords, your tension levels, your feeling of optimism, your opportunity will be fine pulling off of your passion and what you can be best in the world at. But if you are an infant teacher and you're burning a resource engine for an entry-level person at some financial firm, you're eventually going to not be very good at being that teacher, because it's going to be your wheels are out of balance, right? And so it's very important, both for self-care of people in the nonprofit sector, people doing social change, to try to right-size that resource engine, that folks can get a quality wage for their work. And I hear over and over again that people opt out when beginning to be concerned about their children going to college. When they start to do the calculation of how much they really should have saved, they should be saving, that's when they either want to be a foundation CEO or they decide they need to go do a stint in something else. But we have people who have worked for 20 years at Martha's Table, but again, they right-size their resource engine, or they have a partner who is also bringing in resources, and they're realistic with their kids about where they can go to school. But that is a big problem. I agree with the research there that an increase in this sector would change the outcomes, I think.
All right, audience questions. Yes, sir. And there's microphones coming around, so let's wait for that.
There's a lot of people in this room that know as much, if not more, about each of the things we've discussed than I do. So
Not true. One observation and then a two-part question. I having worked in entrepreneurial companies, I agree with your concept of the blank sheet, because it does give you the ability to look at things quite differently. The two questions I have: there are a lot of great not-for-profits that are doing a lot of great work, but the coordination is bad. And I've had some experience in D.C. where I was trying to work on job development, and there's so many different programs, and yet the city doesn't seem to be coordinating it. So I'd like your comment on that, and I don't mean a political comment. The second part of my question is, in terms of your development model, your development project model, which I agree with, how will you build in healthcare? Possibly using some of the ACO models, the accountable care organizational models, to deal with opioid issues and some of the diseases that are rampant in that population.
let me go backwards first. This question of how do we build in health and wellness. The neighborhood we're moving into both has an issue with health, but also the kids in that neighborhood, there's an issue of wellness, long-term. If there aren't enough sidewalks, if the playgrounds aren't safe, et cetera, and wellness is even more complicated. We are talking to both Children's and MedStar about taking a model they have gotten funded by Marriott Foundation at the starting, called the Early Child Investment Network, and finding ways to extend that to the neighborhood. It's still in early stages, but I agree with you that if we don't combine health and wellness, this partner organization that will co-reside in the facility, Community of Hope, also has clinical care. For the most part, the data shows that people in the neighborhood go to the doctor. They're just already quite sick by the time they go. So they're not, it is about preventative and knowledge sharing and getting in front of bad knees and bad hips through nutrition and exercise and all the kinds of things that come long before you need the clinical intervention. The children's insurance in DC means that the kids that come to Martha's Table, for the most part, are well insured. It is about trying to make sure this bigger issue of wellness and the right screenings and the right quality is considered for the parents too, as well as the children. The parents being very critical in that. The other question is about how do we get nonprofit coordination. Look, it was easier for me to answer that question at Gates, and that is that a pile of money in the middle of the table was someone sitting there saying, I'm sitting here and not getting up until you decide how all these micronutrients that you've been competing with for funds add to the change in nutrients for a population, that I'm not going to pit zinc against iron against X against Y. That's easier when there is something, and that here today in DC has to be at some level government, but also donors, the foundations and individual donors saying, I want to see the intersection between. So for instance, at the Joyful Food Markets, DC Central Kitchen has both corner grocery stores and has a lot of schools they do the lunches for. So here we're doing a grocery model in those same schools. So they are now coordinating, and we're doing a test in one of the schools where they're coordinating what is served for lunch. Is broccoli served the week before 3 different ways? Then we have broccoli in our market, and then we see whether it changes purchasing at the corner grocery store to try to see whether that intersection between the commercial model, the school lunch model, and the free Joyful Food Market model can create something that's bigger than each of us working alone. And that ability to have some risk capital to test whether the intersection can create something bigger is really important. I hear Jubilee trying to establish a 20-family cohort with 5 other nonprofits to try to say, if you not only have housing, but you have access to Jubilee Job Corps, and you have access to Martha's Table Early Childhood, and you have access to this and access to that, is it possible that the results warrant additional investment and consideration? So we have to, as donors and as government, incent those kind of collaborations. I'm afraid that oftentimes we decide it needs to be done at scale before we try it at a size that we can learn deeply from the families and the players, but doing fast models. We did 4 Joyful Food Markets before doing 39, headed to 49. That ability, but it took the Philip Graham Fund and Don Graham asking me, what would you do about hunger if you could, based on what you know? And when I described it, he said, we will be the first in. Do you think you can get the city? And I said, if you are first in, I can get the city. But I need to be able to show them something. We need to be able to illustrate it. And so that risk capital with the requirement for, will you work inside the schools? Will you partner with capillary food banks so that you're not paying top dollar for everything and adding trucks to the Martha's Table fleet when Capillary Food Bank has trucks for distribution? That kind of wise donor saying there's a whole stack of issues going on food here. How about we pull them together? Has made a big difference for us. When you try to do it all at once, it generally ends up with a whole bunch of really boring meetings. But finding places to start is really helpful.
Audience questions? Yes, in the back. Suzanne?
I grew up in DC, spending some time at Martha's Table as a child. It was highly encouraged in the school that I went to, in the neighborhood that I grew up in, to volunteer at Martha's Table. Can you talk a little bit about the volunteer model? How heavily do you rely still on volunteers? Does that work? How do you make it work?
I'm so glad you gave me the opportunity to do this. 18,000 people volunteer at Martha's Table a year. That's an enormous number. I think we underutilize it in some ways and over-rely on it in others. Number one, I think that some people feel they relieve their obligation to consider hunger in DC by coming and chopping vegetables or making sandwiches for Martha's Table. We should use that opportunity to ensure people understand where hunger is in DC and where hunger is in their neighborhoods and how it needs to be addressed through everything from their DC council to their school lunches to their X and Y. And we're not doing that adequately yet because we are doers more than advocacy, but we're trying to learn how to take that opportunity that is expressed by the willingness to do service, meaning I believe there can be a better world and I believe I need to participate in that, which is I'm sure what your school was telling you, and taking that not only to making peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, but to upping your understanding of what a food justice system looks like, a healthy food system looks like. So we still rely on it heavily. We get $1.5 million of benefit by our own calculation of labor that is not, I serve as a volunteer at Martha's Table, so I'm part of that. just as I served as a volunteer at the Gates Foundation. So we rely on volunteers, both at the high level. Without the lawyers that helped us with these real estate transactions, we would be going nowhere. Those were all pro bono. This is a wonderful town for pro bono professional efforts. The willingness of the team here to give us advice and encouragement and consider connecting us to people, that is also part of the ethos of DC. People came here because they believe in a better public solution, right? And I think volunteerism is part of that. The second part, though, is that these joyful food markets require 20 volunteers per market to run. And they happen to be in the middle of the day because schools are open in the middle of the day. And that model may not be sustainable over the long haul. So we have to consider, where is workforce development versus volunteerism? How can we use some of these service slots to really build a better workforce development solution that prepares people for more than moving boxes at the back of Whole Foods? Perhaps that's a starting place, but can we help people get further? But yes, volunteerism is still absolutely critical. We have a volunteer website on Martha's Table that gives you opportunities to volunteer all the time, or you can email me if you have a particular interest.
Gentleman in the back.
Yeah, my name's Carl Pulzer, and I've been supporting
Thank you.
Martha's Table for 15 years, and I worked down there, and I wanted to make sure people on the street had food, but I didn't want to give it to them in cash. But anyhow, my question is, on the food desert out there, is there any thought about using the market in some way, in terms of using technology to mass order at least some items for people where they have regular needs, so they can spend their food stamps or their cash in
It's a great
competition?
question. It's a great question.
And you can use Amazon trucks,
Yes.
you know.
So Amazon is testing in 2 states the ability for online purchasers to use food system. They've also made a big if they've got SNAP, to buy with SNAP. That was something that the USDA had to decide. They tested with both Amazon and a couple of other people, because you certainly can get, especially shelf-stable items, at a whole different price, and delivery to your door with Prime is essentially no cost, depending on how you do it. And they made that a monthly charge instead of an annual charge, because people have trouble with annual charges. Amassing, spending money on future benefit is something that's very hard if you're trying to keep the lights on this month. So that's just Amazon. We need a lot of tests. We need tests that use lockers at community rec centers, or that, I think this idea of the school as a hub, because remember, we laid out these schools to cover every neighborhood. The bricks and mortar are there. It would be crazy for Martha's Table to open up out, and it may be too late to adequately cover this region with bricks and mortar, with all the various ways we can get food. We're partnering with a group called Galley Foods and doing low-cost prepared food. Have any of you ever ordered dinner from Galley Foods? It's a wonderful organization catering to people like us in the room. When I am leaving work too late at night to make dinner, and I can at 5:30 say, send 2 dinners to the house, it's better than Uber Eats bringing Thai food in. It's healthy, and my husband and I can enjoy a healthy meal. Well, they're trying to figure out how do you do that for $4 or $5 that we could have at distribution points for areas that have, because we need a combination of solutions, right? It's not open 2 more grocery stores and the problem will be solved. There really is a need. But there on Martin Luther King Avenue in the middle of Ward 8 is a really great juicing company doing it's a local, they're entrepreneurs, and they're doing a great job. So we also need investments in local entrepreneurs building food innovation businesses. And we're even hopeful that our new facility, which has a commercial quality kitchen, will be able to be part of figuring out solutions and incubation for both young people and adults to figure out new ways to address food systems. So I think it's all of the above. Out of Chicago, there's a group called Top Box that does really low-cost CSAs. I think a $5, $10, and $20 box that you don't have to commit to ahead of time, but that is available with the vegetables of the harvest right then, is also a viable way to do it. How can we use 5, 6, 7, 8 ways to do food systems reform, but in a way that's coordinated enough that we can see if the needle moves?
I think there are actually a lot more questions, but it looks like we've hit the end of our
We
time.
have 28 seconds left.
Well, I think in that part, everybody wants to know where Amazon's going to locate their second headquarters. So, but you'll probably just skip that. So
I'll just smile. I honestly don't know the process is as it was described, but I have been a very popular woman again. You know, when you're running a foundation, you're very, very popular, and when you're looking for a second city for headquarters, you become equally popular for at least a period of time.
Patty Stonesifer, thank you very much
Thank
for
you,
spending time
Toby.
with us.
This was fun. It was good, yeah. Good.